Hi friends, it's Pastor Matt asking you if you can see clearly. During these Friendship Together videos, we have been looking at some passages that are a part of our 90-day Through the Gospels reading. And in Mark chapter 8, we have a weird healing that Jesus does that at first doesn't seem to work right. The passage is found in Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. It says, "And they came to Bethsaida, Jesus and his disciples. And some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see people, but they look like trees walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. When he opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village." When you look at this passage, I remember reading this even as a kid and going, what's going on here? Did Jesus just not get it right the first time? Right? It seems like, okay, I laid my hands on you and now your vision is blurry. Well, that's half the miracle. Let me see if I can get the second half right. Is that what's going on here, that Jesus wasn't powerful enough to pull off the full miracle the first time? That seems unlikely. And so what is going on in Mark chapter 8? It's actually kind of exciting when you look at this in the full context of what's going on in Mark, because the healing of this blind man is intentionally done by Jesus in this way in order to represent the faith vision of the disciples. The disciples, as we're walking through Mark, are beginning to understand who Jesus is. And if you look at Mark, it's actually immediately after that Jesus heals this man, this blind man, that Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ. There's some clarity that they're starting to see. There's some vision that the disciples have of who Jesus is and what his real identity is in the Gospel of Mark. But it's still fuzzy. Because if you're at all familiar with Mark 8, you recognize that in Mark 8 and 9, as soon as Jesus is identified as the Christ by Peter, he tells his disciples, "Yep, and I'm going to go and be crucified and rise again." And Peter says, "That's not going to happen. No way will we let that happen." And Jesus actually has to say to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," because you want the things of men, not the things of God. Because while the disciples are starting to see that Jesus is the promised Messiah, they still think of him as a conquering Messiah, as a military Messiah, as a government Messiah. They don't fully and clearly understand that Jesus is the Messiah who is going to give his life for people's sins. They will. Like the man who is healed in Mark 8, 22 through 26, the disciples have partial vision now, but there will come a time after Jesus' resurrection when they see all of this clearly and then carry that clear message to the rest of the world. And so as we look at Mark 8, 22 through 26, we don't understand this miracle to be about Jesus just not quite having the juice to pull off the miracle right the first time. In fact, this miracle seems to be done like this intentionally, precisely to represent what we see in the verses that follow, that the disciples have some understanding of who Jesus is, a blurry understanding of Jesus as Messiah, but they don't quite yet have a fully clear understanding. Jesus will give that to them. And we pray for clear understanding for ourselves so that, like those disciples, we can share Jesus clearly with others.